It's a pleasure to be here, and it's almost like coming home having been raised in headquarters. My great-grandparents, John and Ellen Malloy, arrived in Pierce in 1868 when my grandfather, John Malloy, was 6 months old. And so my great-grandmother was buried here in the Pierce Cemetery and was reported to be the third person to be buried in that cemetery. And it's really coming home to be here today, and it's a pleasure to have you here to go through this program, which I'm really honored to be able to give you. I want to set the stage. Actually, Washington Territory, this was when the United States had just created the Washington Territory in 1853, and included all of Washington, what is now Washington, Idaho, Montana, and parts of Wyoming. So it was a huge, huge territory. The only cities at the time, there was Portland, which was at the mouth of the Columbia, and Olympia, which was the head of the Washington Territory. And then there was Fort Walla Walla, where Colonel George Wright had the cavalry and the army as it was constituted at that time. And it's also important to understand that the creation of the Territory of Washington occurred just 2 years or 3 years before Isaac Stevens, who was the territorial governor of the Territory of Washington, came through and started on the West Coast and came through Idaho into Montana, forcing basically the Indian tribes into treaties. And it was a very contentious time. They had a big rendezvous where they bargained with the tribes, and the Nez Perce had the largest reservation. That was all of north central Idaho and the Wallowas. And the reason they gave them such a big reservation was because they thought if the Nez Perce tribe joined the other tribes in fighting, the U.S. Army would probably lose the battle. So the Nez Perce tribe came in with a lot of leverage, but it was very contentious because what had always been their territory, now there were boundaries, and they didn't like it, and they wanted the non-tribal members out of their reservations. And so understand that this gold discovery occurred in an area that was part of the Nez Perce tribal reservation. So it was very antsy kind of time. And Shoshone County, which was created in 1858, and it included all of north central Idaho, except we had Nez Perce County, you had Idaho County, and the rest was Shoshone County. And this ended up being the county seat of that entire county. In fact, really, except for the Olympia, the only organized government in the Washington Territory. And so it all started with Elias Davidson Pierce, who was the gentleman you see there. And he was a strange man. He was a lawyer who never practiced law. He was a soldier who never fought. He was a trader who died broke. He was born in Virginia, migrated as a young man to Indiana, where he studied law with a lawyer. In those days, you became a lawyer by studying with lawyers instead of law school. From there, he got typhoid, and then in 1854, President James Polk declared war on Mexico, so he joined the Indiana. Actually, it was the Indiana infantry that went to fight for the United States, and that's when we took over Texas, all of Southern California, and that's basically when we established the borders that we now have in the Southwest. From there, from Indiana, actually when he joined the Army, he was stationed in Mexico City, and he actually became a captain. But the reason he became a captain was not because of the battles that he fought, but disease was taking out most of the soldiers, and his superior would die from disease. He'd get promoted to that position. That superior would die, and he'd be promoted to that position. So it wasn't as if he'd earned the title of captain, but that was his established rank. When war was over, he went to California, where he and a partner ended up supplying the gold mines and the mining camps with supplies. But he was elected to the state legislature, during which he actually voted to require people who had African Americans to return the slaves to their owners, to exclude all Chinese and people of Asian blood. Very controversial. But while he was in the legislature, his partner ran off with all the money that they had gotten from the business that they'd had supplying the mining camps with supplies. And so what he did is he ended up coming up and establishing a relationship with the Nez Perce tribe. And what he'd do is he'd buy horses for $10 a horse, take the herd down to the mining camps and sell them for $100 a horse. So it was a very lucrative business that he had established, and he actually became fluent in the Nez Perce language. And he wanted to come up, but the times were very tense with the tribes. And so he was told not to come, but he did. He and this fellow partner, Seth Farrell, came up, and they got into the North Fork because he'd heard that there was shiny stuff in the North Fork of the Clearwater, and there they found some gold. And so they went back. He went back to Walla Walla, where he was now staying, and tried to got 8 or 9 other men to come back, and they came up to what is right here in Pierce, Idaho, and this is where they discovered gold. And the fellow that discovered the gold was William Bassett, which would be the next image. And William Bassett was quite a guy. He was a carpenter from Portland. He'd been born in Connecticut, and he'd been had fought with the 1st Regiment of the Oregon Mounted Volunteers in the Indian Wars. But he came up, and he's the one that actually discovered the gold in Canal Gulch. And Pierce wrote about that discovery. It was in September of 1860. And this is what Pierce said about it. He said, "We found gold in every place, in the stream, in the banks, and the flats, and gold generally diffused from the surface to the bedrock. I never saw a party of men so excited." So what he wanted to do was to develop this gold rush, because that's, if you didn't get an infrastructure, you couldn't get the gold out and you couldn't get it to market. So anytime there was gold discovered, they wanted to get people interested to come and get the commerce going that would be necessary to have the mining camp survive. So he and Farrell returned to Walla Walla and got interested. It was 8 or 9 men, and they went back to Walla Walla, and they took some gold dust, $800 worth of gold dust, put it in a window, and then William Bassett went to Portland. And in Portland, of course, that was the major city. There's nothing but, understand at this time, there's nothing but a sawmill in what is now Seattle. That's how barren this area was when it came to white settlements. And he got talked to the next guy, who is the next image, if we could. And then when they started building, this is what they needed to build: sluice boxes. And this is what they call an Armstrong. They're pulling the saw up and down over the platform to create boards for the sluice boxes. Imagine how hard that would be. Sluice boxes take a lot of lumber, and that's one board at a time that they're sawing in those Armstrong. We called them whip saws. So eventually, Pierce convinced 33 men to venture back, and it was a big consternation because they didn't want mining development in the Nez Perce reservation for fear that there'd be an Indian war and that the United States Army would lose. So the Indian agent in Lapwai, which is where Spalding established his mission, a fellow named Kane, advised against it, and General George Wright ordered him not to go. But they went anyway. He sent troops after them, but they outpaced them and never caught up with them. And so Pierce arrived at Orofino Creek and started building cabins, as you see with the whipsaw, uh, the whipsaw, and for the sluice boxes, and prospecting for more gold. In January of 1861, they formed the Orofino Mining District. And that mining district, they agreed, would apply California gold mining law. And the district encompassed all of what is now the tributary of Orofino Creek and those other creeks. And they had what they called miners' meetings. And they established minor meetings, and minor meetings would resolve disputes that occurred between the miners and their claims and other civil disputes by a vote of the mining, the meetings committees. And that was the only form of law that they had during the gold rush in Pierce. And when Bassett returned, he returned from Portland, and there he had talked to a fellow named Alonzo Leland. And that'd be the next image, please. It's hard to see, he's a little guy there. Anyway, that's Alonzo, and he was the editor of the Weekly Portland, which was the largest newspaper in the entire region. And there were efforts to get people to think that there were gold rushes to get people to come in, and they ended up being nothing but hoaxes. And so this is what Alonzo Leland wrote in the Portland Weekly. He said, "We are not in the habit of placing great reliance upon mining news, but the dust of Mr. Bassett exhibits and accounts he gives of the country to us is more indicative of gold in paying quantities than any discovery heretofore and made in our Northwest possible." So he's the one that basically got the word out that there was gold in Pierce and the gold rush was on. So the next thing they had to do with when the miners, this was actually, the Pierce gold rush was the first gold rush or the major gold rush in the Northwest. There'd been a couple of small finds in the Colville area, and this is the first mining discovery where the people came from the west instead of from the east, as they had with the California gold discovery at Sutter's Mill. So then you had to get up here to Pierce. You made it to Lewiston, you either came by wheeler, stern wheeler, by foot, on horse, or by wagon. And once you made it to Lewiston, you had to go to cul-de-sac, up the grade to the top of the prairie, across where Craigmont is now and where Moeller used to be, and then over and down into Greer. And that old Greer grade is still there. If you go up the river just about a quarter of a mile or so, there's that narrow gravel road. That's the old Greer road that they used to come down. And when they were bringing supplies, the grades were so steep they had to hook a log on the back of a wagon to break it so the wagons wouldn't run into the oxen or the horses going down the grade. And they had a kid actually at Greer with water. They had the iron rims, and the wooden brake would go up against the iron rim and get so hot it'd start to burn. And they had a kid down there with water. He made his money pouring water on the wheels so they wouldn't burn up. And so that was the problem, or that was the trip that they had to make in order to get there. And now if we go to the next one, when they got to Greer, there was what they called can you see that? That's a little hard to see, isn't it? But that was the cabin on the Orofino side, on the highway side of Greer, when you got down to the bottom of the grade. And they called that was called a stage stand. And it was at the foot of the grade was a building known, and of which it was said a man was sure to get a good meal and a bed and a safe transit across the river. And it was the ferry that took him across the river. And that's the next photo, please. And here's the ferry. And that was the only means of getting across the river. And there was a toll to get across. Actually, it was run by William Craig. That name is probably familiar to you, Craig Mountain. He was married to a Nez Perce woman, Isabel, and Tom Bell, and a fellow named Schultz. And they ran this ferry, and they charged $1.50 for a freight wagon and animals and $1 for a pleasure wagon and a team, 25 cents for each additional horse, 75 cents for a rider and a saddle horse, and 25 cents for a foot passenger, and 15 cents for sheep, goats, and hogs. So that was the cost of getting across the river. Now, once you got across the river, the first stop was at the Texas Ranch, which was later called the Lola Ranch, and that's the next image if you can. And this was a very, very famous stopping point. This was the first place when you got to the top of the hill. And I don't know if you know where Jerry Moore's place is, but it was down the draw from down in Lolo Canyon from there, down below actually our place at Fraser. And that was run by a couple of immigrants. And one was Martin Molly, who was a Swiss immigrant, and Peter Arcade, who was a French immigrant. And actually, my grandmother had some letters written in French by them, but it was just so arcane, we haven't been able to find anybody that can translate them. And it was said by a person who was a regular at the Lolo Ranch that you could get for 2 bits, you could get a glass of Hellfire whiskey, and for 4 bits, a plate of beans and bacon. So that was the first stop. The next stop was the Puget Ranch, called the Ford Station on Ford's Creek, right about where Weippe is now. And those were the Pugets, who were French immigrants. There was a husband and a wife and a child. And that was became a very important aspect of this. The winter of 61, 62 was the worst winter. This is getting from the top of the grade here to Pierce, which was about 15 miles from the Ford Station, they figured. Or maybe they've been calling it from the Lolo Ranch. But it started snowing on the 1st of October, and it was so cold the thermometers broke, and 47 feet of snow fell during that winter. 47 feet, which later compacted into 5 feet of almost solid ice. So that was the winter, and they were still trying to get supplies into Pierce for the miners. And people that lagged behind or got off the trail frankly just froze to death. And they employed men at 30 cents a pound to pack the supplies into Pierce from the Puget or the Lolo Ranch, all the way to, and they were carrying from 60 to 100 pounds on their back, going in by snowshoe. So and the winter was so bad that here in Pierce, there was a scurvy developed. And Mrs. Puget, there had been a wagon full of potatoes that had come up, and they couldn't get any further than the Puget Ranch because of the snow. So she had them bury the potatoes so that they wouldn't freeze and spoil. When the scurvy broke out, she had them dig up the potatoes, and again, men hauled those potatoes by snowshoe into Pierce, and they sliced raw potatoes, dipped them in vinegar, and cured the scurvy. But imagine carrying those 50 to 60, 70 pounds of weight on your back with snowshoes in that kind of snow. So that's what they were confronted with when getting to Pierce Gold Rush. And let me tell you, the mining was not easy. We go to the next image, please. This is a sluice box. And the first thing you had to do was get the lumber to build a sluice box. And of course, they had riffles on them so that the gold would settle behind the riffles, and the stream would be enough to get the gravel off through the sluice box and leave the gold behind in the riffles. And the thing you had to do is often dig a ditch to get the water to your claim. So you could have, and once you got the water to the claim, you had to have a head of water, so you had a strong enough stream to go through that sluice box that would force the gravel out and let the gold stay in. And this is one man describing what it was like digging a ditch here in Pierce during that time. He said, we went out before sunrise and started work by starlight and worked until after sunset and went home by starlight. We would work every day, rain or shine, and we were often wet to the skin 10 minutes after we had left our camp. We kept going on with wet clothing all day. One partner went ahead with a broad axe or a mattock, cutting the brush and kinnikinick. And so the next person turning it and the sod, turning over the sod, and then on down behind him, I would be following with a spade and taking out the dirt, and followed with finishing up the ditch. So that's from before light till after dark. Once you had the ditch, then as I said, you had to get ahead of water. And this is what one miner described that involved. Because you build up, they'd get a dam, build a dam, let out a certain amount of water, the pressure would be, the gravity would create the current that was necessary to operate the sluice box. And he said, I got up at 5 in the morning, walked 3 miles to the head of the ditch where the impounding dam was, go back 3 miles for breakfast, wash gold all day, then walk 3 miles back to the dam to close the dam so we build up another head of water, and then walk back 3 miles for dinner. So here's, you worked all day and walked 12 miles just to get the water that was necessary to do the work you were doing during the day. Imagine that today. That was the lure of gold here, right here in Pierce, what is now Pierce, Idaho. I want to just mention a couple of characters. I don't have an image of him. I don't know that anybody does. But in addition to Pierce, there was the town of Orofino, and Orofino was down where the Cardiff Mill was. And it was as big or bigger than Pierce. Billy Rhodes was African American. He'd been taken to California as a child. We don't know whether it was as slave or free. But he came up here and made the biggest discovery of anybody, and it was where Orofino was sitting, so they dug up the town to get the gold that was under it. That's why Pierce still exists and Orofino does not. He made the biggest find. Of course, Rhodes Creek is named after him. He made the biggest find during the Pierce Gold Rush. Went back to California and down to Honduras, came back, decided he was going to find the source of the mother lode, went over to the Idaho-Montana border during the winter looking for the source. They all said there had to be a major source of this gold getting into these streams. It had to come from somewhere. God didn't just make it in the streams. It had to have been washed down from the main source. And so he goes over in the winter with 2 pals. He dies of dysentery. They bury him in the snow 2 times before they get to the ground, bury him the 3rd time in the ground. And my understanding is that his grave is marked with a bunch of stones around where he was buried. But he gave it all away. He was one of these good, nice guys, always there for anybody that had a hard luck story, was a soft touch. And Billy Rhodes was just a remarkable, remarkable young guy. Let's go to the next image, please. Now this is what they had 3 types of claims. They had gulch claims, creek claims, and bluff claims. Now this would be a bluff claim. But look at the head of water you'd have to get that kind of stream, to get the earth off the cliff, so you get the gold down into where you could get at it. And then if we go to the next image, this is how big the operation was. That gives you an idea of the amount of water that was needed. Here's a water wheel, getting water, collecting it for the sluice boxes. And think of the amount of boards that had to be whipsawed from that Armstrong whipsaw to manufacture that kind of operation. The town of Orofino was 1.5 miles south and was as big, and the Wells Fargo Pony Express headquarters was in Orofino. And that's where the miners would come in every Sunday to get mail from their relatives or to get news from how the Civil War was going. And there were real fights in the Pierce because during the Civil War was going on, and a lot of the young men from border states that had stayed with the Union didn't want to be conscripted by the Union Army, so they fled the state. A lot of them ended up here, so there were real rows between the Unionists and the Confederates. And news of the war would, on Sundays, often would start fights once the news was received. There were 7,000 people in the Orofino mining district, and that's when Seattle was, as I said, just had a Yesler mill and shacks of a half a dozen employees, and the other major towns were Olympia and Portland, as I've indicated. And miners played as hard as they worked. Every saloon, boarding house, and hotel sold whiskey by the gulp, by the quart, and by the gallon. So if you decide you're going to chug a lug, the bartender would count the gulps, and that would determine how much you're going to have to pay. It was a rough and tumble place. And there were also dancing girls and poker, of course, poker tables where there were tall tales were told and mining claims were won and lost at the poker table. The next image, please. This is the city of Pierce as it was then. Gives you an idea how, and that's not counting Orofino, which was as bigger during the, you can see it right there. It's pretty prominent. Right there. Yeah, there you are. That's where we are today.
And Mike Eagle's house wasn't made yet.
So anyway, to this town, the next image, please. This is a stagecoach that was bringing in people to the Pierce Gold Rush. And it was a bustling town. As I said, the district had 7,000 people. And I want you to just imagine the cacophony of the sounds. The clang of the blacksmith hammering on iron on his anvil, the braying of the pack mules, the whinnying of the freight wagon horses, the music, the sound of music and laughter wafting out of the saloon doors, and the chatter of the miners catching up on the news of a new find or of a claim lost in a card game. And there were smells, the coal smoke from the forges, the cigar smoke from the saloons, the horse manure, the aroma from the kitchens, and the smell of fresh hay at the horse stables. That's the kind of exciting place that Pierce was during the gold rush. So it had to have been an exciting, as hard as they worked, it had to be an exciting place. One of my all-time heroes is the next image, the first school in Pierce. And there were two married couples that were aware of. That was John and Bridget Gaffney, both Irish immigrants, and then my great-grandparents, John and Ellen Malloy. And they paid a guy to teach. And this was an old saloon, and they taught there were only, I think, 3 or 4 kids, Gaffney kids and a Malloy kid in the schoolhouse, but they actually started a school there for the kids that just the two couples had during the gold rush. But the next image, please. And this is my hero of all of the people. This is Israel Cohen. And in any event, he came out to California. He was in the gold mines there for a while, then made it up here. He was a magistrate judge. He was a county commissioner. He was in the territorial legislature. He may have even been the sheriff. But he ultimately ended up hauling the mail between Pierce and Lewiston. So that meant he went down to Greer, up the grade, down to cul-de-sac, and then to Lewiston with the mail. And that was 40 to 60 pounds of mail. And he did it all on foot. He didn't use a mule, he didn't use a horse, he didn't use a wagon. And he did it on snowshoes, of course, during the winter. And he did it with a club foot. How's that for being tough? And you go up the cemetery here. His is the really nice gravestone that's up there. And when I come up to decorate my great-grandmother's grave, I always leave a flower at his grave site because of my admiration of what a hell of a guy Israel Cohen was. But things were not going well. There was an underside. Besides Whiskey by the Gulp and poker games and dancing girls, there was a criminal element afoot as well. And the minor meetings were successful in resolving civil disputes, but had no effect on the criminal, had no criminal sanctions, and no means. There was no government. The whole government at this time in this Washington territory was the miners' meeting in the mining district. That was it. Shoshone County had no government, zero. And so the problem was they had to take the gold from here down to Lewiston to get it sold and get it to the market. And William Rowland and George Law were known as horse thieves who always waylaid an unwary placer miner. And the placer miner actually was murdered, and his pack train and $500 worth of gold were stolen. The early day packer, Enos Williams, charged $4 an ounce to haul the gold from here to Lewiston because of the danger in taking the gold from here with the way for fear he'd get waylaid and be either murdered, injured, or all the gold would be stolen. And ultimately he ended up refusing to haul any gold because of the danger. And the problem came to a head when with the murder of Pat Ford. This is Henry Plummer. And I don't know if any of you have heard of the Plummer gang. He was in Lewiston, he was a suave, well-dressed ladies' man, professional gambler, what we today would call a real schmoozer. Well-liked, personable, everybody that knew him liked him. And professional gambling then was like being a doctor or a lawyer. It was nothing untoward about that as a profession. And he was quite the man in the city of Lewiston. What they didn't know about Henry Plummer was that he had been convicted of murdering a man with whose wife he was caught in bed with in California. He was convicted of that. The governor of California gave him a pardon, but then he committed another crime, so he headed up to Walla Walla. And there he killed a man in a dispute over a couple of prostitutes. So he made it up to Lewiston, where they had no idea what his history was. What they also didn't know was that he was returned to form as the head of what was called the Plummer Gang. And they murdered, terrorized, and robbed travelers between Pierce and Lewiston. And historians said that his gang included, and this is a quote from the early days, every crooked gambler, horse thief, high grader, hold-up man, and general tough that was a member of the combination owing allegiance to William Plummer. The gang operated out of cul-de-sac and had waylay stations called shebangs. And in fact, if you go to Weippe and you go out Cemetery Road toward Lolo Creek, there's an old cabin there, and that is reputed to have been one of the shebangs. And they would operate out of there, so they wouldn't have to go all the way to cul-de-sac after they'd murdered someone or stolen their gold. Well, anyway, during the time that he was murdering and stealing and just basically imposing mayhem on all the travelers between Pierce and Lewiston, he ran onto Pat Ford, who was coming back from Lewiston to Pierce. And Pat Ford told him that he was on to him, he knew what he was up to, and he wasn't going to put up with it. They had a real confrontation on the road between Pierce and Lewiston. And so rather than do anything to Pat Ford there, they followed him here into Orofino, where Pat Ford had his saloon. And instead of going after him, they shot up the entire town, just bullets flying everywhere in the town of Orofino, down here a mile and a half south of here. And when Pat Ford came out, and he had a pistol in each hand, and they riddled him with bullets. And they said, that's enough. That will end. We're not going to, that's more than we can put up with. Pat Ford was well known, he was well liked, and he was a decent human being, and he was murdered for no reason at all. So the thing was, the mining district, it was time to confront the crimes head on, and they concluded that the county was very badly in need of courts if the peace and dignity of the territory was going to be maintained. So they decided to have an election. And the election was operated by the county auditor from Walla Walla. Walla Walla, where Fort Walla Walla was, had a county government operating there. And he came over and supervised the election. And during the election, I can name them all for you if you want, but I'll just tell you that they elected 3 county commissioners, and they elected an auditor, a sheriff. His name was a probate judge, a sheriff. His name was Gillespie, and an auditor, an assessor, a treasurer, a coroner, and a constable. And that was when Idaho then had its first, what is now Idaho, had its first elected government in its history. So you are sitting where the first elected government in the state of Idaho was formed. This is the place right here where we're sitting. So what the question was then, they were tired of paying rent for a courthouse, so they decided they're going to have to build a courthouse. And so the need was obvious. So during the May of 1862 court term, the county commissioners appointed 2 men to select a site for the new courthouse and appointed a sheriff, this was Gillespie, to design it. And on June the 7th, 1862, the commissioners accepted a bid to build the courthouse and jail here at Pierce for $3,700 in county script, which meant you could use the script for any debt you had to pay to the county. And the bid, so men used broad axes to hew the logs that you see right here where we're sitting into squared timbers, and they were joined with half dovetailed notches, which was a particular design used to connect log houses at the time. And on the main floor here where we are were 2 jail cells and the sheriff's office. And you can see the bars for where the jails were. And then, of course, they had the timbers come out here with the cells, and they drove kegs of nails into the timber so they couldn't cut their way out. They'd run into nails. And that's how they kept the cells secure. And then the sheriff's office was here. And then on the rear wall back in the back, they had stairs that came up to the 2nd floor. They were outside stairs. And that's where court was held. And that's where the commissioners met. And that's where the records were kept. And there's one sort of odd occurrence. When the commissioners, there was the county auditor is a guy named Houck, Mr. Houck. He was from Philadelphia, and he was sort of a dude in the mining camp, you know, a suit, a trimmed beard. And he was the auditor, and he would attend the commissioners' meetings. In addition to taking the minutes of the meetings, as he was supposed to do, he would participate in the discussions and then vote. And he didn't, when he didn't have a vote, and then record his vote in the minutes. And it would be okay, except when there was a tie. And when there was a tie with 2 votes on each side, and Houck was one of them, the question was, what would they do then? So in any event, here we are. Right now, we're sitting in the courthouse where the first jails were built, the first sheriff's office was held, upstairs where the commissioners met, court was held, and the records were kept. And actually, the original court records are intact at the museum in Orofino. So I'm honored to be able to be here with you today to assemble in the courthouse where the first elected government in what is now Idaho occurred. God bless Idaho and all the pioneers who made it possible. Thanks very much. Any questions?
Who appointed the first judge?
What's that?
How were the judges appointed?
They were elected.
They were elected.
Yeah, probate judge was elected, and then they had, yeah.
So Abraham Lincoln didn't have anything to do with this.
No. He would have only appointed the federal judges for the territories. And that would have been in Olympia, the federal. territorial judge would have been in Olympia. It can't be all that clear. Would anybody other have any questions?
Is there still a room upstairs?
Should be. I haven't been upstairs.
Harry's been upstairs. Good one.
I mean, just think. Right, you're sitting right now where the convicts, where the robbers were, and you wouldn't have been able to cut yourself out through the nails. So that's how we ended up with the courthouse in Pierce, Idaho.
John, how long was it an active courthouse?
It was an active courthouse up until they they changed the county seat up to the mining district when they discovered silver up in the mining district, and the next county seat of Shoshone was Mullen in Mullen. So it was the county seat for all of Shoshone County, clear to the Canadian border, up until it was moved to Mullen. I forget just what year that was.
I think 1885.
Could be, yeah. Yeah.
Why do you think they named Pierce after Elias Davidson Pierce?
Well, because he was the guy that made it possible, and he was. If it hadn't been for him, the discovery wouldn't have been made, or at least it wouldn't have been made when and where it was. And strange guy, but I think he challenged all the existing authority. When he went up to the North Fork, he lied to the Indians at the Saukah to get up there. He had a pal with him, Farrell, and he said they were going in to do some surveying, and he was lying. They had a bunch of prospecting tools on their mules. And then when he came in with the original 5 men, they went up the North Fork. He came up through the forest up to Pierce. They said the forest was so thick that they sometimes have to climb trees to see where to go to the next place to get up here. So they did that to avoid the Indians, find out what they were up to, and stopping them from coming in here.
So James Silcock brought them up the second time?
That's what they say, but I don't believe that. Yeah, she was not an Nez Perce. That story has been put out there, but I don't believe that.
She wasn't in this.
She was not an Nez Perce. No. Well, she was. Excuse me. She was an Nez Perce. She was an Nez Perce, but she was from a tribe out of Lewiston, down south of Lewiston.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry. She was an Nez Perce, but she wouldn't have known Pierce. She wouldn't have known how to get here. This was not her territory. The Indians in the Saukah, and then I know that they came up here for the Camas. I mean, my grandmother used to talk about, there's a bench on our ranch, and in the fall, the tribal members would come up there and butcher their deer. And they were fine with that, even though that was their homestead at the time. But she would have had I don't think she would have had any knowledge of the geography of anything up in this area of the woods.
Years ago, Robin Johnson gave a presentation at the community center, and he spoke of the agricultural business and enterprises that the Nez Perce and Tami had to feed the miners. Do you know anything about? It was a great presentation.
If it happened, it came later,
Okay.
because they basically when they had the reservation, Spalding and Whitman's whole idea was to take a people who had relied on hunting and fishing and gathering and make them farmers, because then they could get them to go to church. They'd have Sundays off, and they could control the people there in the village. They wouldn't be out roaming around. And so they were very adamant that they learned farming skills, and some of them did. And some of them did supply the mines, I think, later on. But there was a huge resistance. Spalding was not a popular guy. You know, he had a whipping post at the place where he had his church. The blacksmith, he had a Nez Perce wife. He was beating her up all the time. She ran away. Spalding had her brought back, tied to the whipping post, and lashed for abandoning her husband. So that was God's work in Spalding's life. And there's a reason that the Nez Perce did not want whites in the reservation. And there was good reason for that. And in fact, the Lewis and Clark, on their way back east, killed a Blackfoot. It's the only one they killed during the entire venture. And after that, everybody tried to get around the Blackfeet. If you went east, you avoided the Blackfeet because they were really, really tough. In fact, the South Passage was found not looking for a passage, but to try to avoid having to deal with the Blackfeet. And when Isaac Stevens was forcing the treaties on the tribes, and this was at Walla Walla, he called the chief of the Yakimas in, and he said, if you don't agree with it, you'll be ankle deep in blood. That was the pressure that they brought to get them to agree to the reservations. And I was at a presentation a while back where a Nez Perce man got up and started talking in Nez Perce. He said, you know what I was telling you? I was telling you what the treaty said. How much of it did you understand? He said, what makes you think we understood any more of it in English? So that's why the tensions really ran very, very high.
How long did the mining last here? It really wasn't that long, was it?
Well, it lasted 3 or 4 years. The big money was taken out. They figure it was about $900 million worth of gold taken out of here. And you multiply that by 20 today's dollars. That's what we're looking at. I mean, it was one of the miners that was robbed. They stole 100 pounds of gold dust. 100 pounds, not ounces, 100 pounds of gold dust. The amount of gold that was taken out here was incredible. It was a huge, huge, huge find. And I don't think people have any idea of the amount of work it took to get it out of the ground and the amount of value it had once they did. The problem was getting it to Lewiston, where you could be sold and taken to be assayed and then sold. That was the biggest problem, getting supplies here and the gold back to Lewiston.
Similar challenge to wood materials today, right?
What's that?
It's similar challenge to wood and biomass utilization today. The challenge is getting it to a place where it can be to the market.
So let's not call what we see here today logging. I hope I don't offend anybody, but I was raised in headquarters, and I know the difference between logging and what's happening here, and it's very disturbing to me. I just was yesterday I was down to Grandad Bridge. It made me almost made me physically sick what I saw. Like that, nothing but stumps. Just, it's awful. And what's going to happen, there aren't going to be any jobs left by the time they're done. There will be no logging jobs in Clearwater County when they get through with what they're doing. It'll be like the miners up in the Coeur d'Alenes where there's no more mines. And they wonder why people are frustrated. They lose their jobs. They end up on minimum wage after having made. When I was growing up in headquarters, every family could afford a car. They had enough cash to send their kids to school. They could buy, of course, they got it almost rent-free in headquarters, company-owned houses. But everybody made a decent living. And they were unionized, and as were the miners unionized. Once the unions went out, there were no pensions, no medical care. You got injured. If you didn't qualify under workers' comp, you were on your own. So that's it. You don't have to wonder why there's frustration today by the people who used to make really, really good livings. Here in the 50s, Clearwater County and Shoshone County had two of the highest per capita earnings in the state of Idaho. Today now, Clearwater County, Shoshone County, and Adams County have the 3 lowest per capita earnings per capita. And that's what's happened when you abuse the resource like we have. So there.
John,
I sure feel better. I want you to know I got
Feel better now? Yeah.
I feel a lot better, yeah.
Do you know how long the courthouse was in operation when it closed?
I think it closed when they moved the courthouse to Mullen. And I'm not sure, but I think that was in the early 1870s. It was when they discovered silver up in the silver mines. And that's when the population moved up there. And then they took everything here in the county courthouse and moved it up. Later became Wallace, of course.
So did they use it as a sheriff's office and a jail later after?
I assume they did, but I don't know. But I would be surprised if they didn't, because it was the only law around. You know, if you weren't in Lewiston, the only other law existed was in Pierce, Idaho. And you know, the Gaffneys and the Malloys, Bridget and Peter Gaffney are buried in Fraser Cemetery. So if you want to see, they have a nice big stone there. As the first married couple that came here to Pierce. And they later started what they filed a preemption. So once homesteading was allowed, they'd have first right to the land that they filed a preemption on. And they had their homestead there in Weippe. And they said young John Gaffney was the brightest, top of his class, and the best athlete in his class. But they didn't mention he was the only one in their class.
You mentioned a camp or a spot on Ford Creek. Do you have any idea where that might be?
I don't, but I would bet it was somewhere just along where the bridge is, but I don't know for sure.
The bridge coming into Weippe?
Yeah. That would be my guess. They'd have to be close to water. They'd need the water from the creek.
I thought that the cabin, when you come up Lower Fourth Creek, when you come up onto the prairie, I thought there was a house there that was used for people coming up, a place for people to stay before they got into Pierce.
Well, it could have been, but that would have been later. The Lolo Ranch and the Pujade Ranch, the Lolo, known as the Lolo Ranch, and the Ford Station were the only during the major part of the gold rush. Later on, of course, the Chinese came in. And that was in fact, we found in the basement of the museum in Orofino what we think was the original altar for the Chinese temple that they had here in Pierce. Well, the Chinese came in and finished up taking what gold the other miners hadn't had the energy or the will to remove. It's an amazing story that Little Pierce, Idaho was where Idaho got started. It got the people into this part of the state, and for the rest was history. So we have a lot to be proud of in this neck of the woods. And who'd have thunk it? Here we are. Okay, any other questions? If not, thanks for coming. There's trees back there.